All right. Hello. My name is Marlena, and this year I felt compelled to watch all of the films that were nominated for Best Picture by the Oscars, and I have some thoughts. I have my trusty laptop here to help guide me through this video. But basically, I have broken up my thoughts into 4 sections. So first, we're going to go over time and place. We're going to basically put all of the films that were nominated on a timeline. Then we're going to put them on like this spectrum from non-realism to realism. We'll quickly go through some common themes I found across all of these films, and then we're going to wrap it up with my official rankings and final thoughts. I hope me doing that didn't fuck up the mic. All right, so first things first, we got to set ourselves in time and place. So, quick caveat, I made this timeline primarily off of like my prior knowledge and understanding from college classes, from high school history classes. I did pretty well on my AP exams. So I think I have enough prior knowledge to, have a general sense of what's going on in these films. But then also I did some quick internet confirming to make sure that I wasn't spreading, lies. So we start with Hamnet, which is set in the 1850s, 90s, late 16th century England. We're in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is near London, based off of like context clues of the film. And yes, I am also using the films themselves to help me understand their historical context. And 2 important historical happenings at this time are the bubonic plague. And this also seems to be a time, 16th century England, when like Western English mysticism, herbalism, general witchiness is happening. So that's this time period. Then we fast forward a few centuries into Frankenstein. Now that technically starts off in 1857, but then it goes back in time to give us this full story of Le Creature. So basically, we're operating in the 1850s. So this is right in between the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age, like the first Industrial Revolution versus the second Industrial Revolution. The Gilded Age is thrown in there. The Gilded Age might just be an American term. I did not look that up. But this is also a time period when like modern science and how we think of it today was just starting out. And we're in Europe with very general European vibes. I think it's technically Edinburgh at some point, and like also cold places in Europe is where we're set. Then we fast forward a bit to Train Dreams. So this movie tells the story of one man from technically late 1890s to all the way to 1968, but I would say the meat of the movie and the story is really around the 1920s and 30s, and it takes place in the US. Specifically, the man lives in like Idaho in a log cabin on a river that Wikipedia told me is called Moyi River, but also that's too many details for our purposes. So the main character travels for work on a railroad once, but most of the time he's in a forest chopping down trees for wood, for industrial purposes, somewhere in the US. He got to these places via a train, I guess. Then we get to Sinners, which is set in 1932, Jim Crow South, Mississippi, end of US prohibition. I think we're on the verge of the Great Depression. Technically, the stock market has already crashed in 1929, so I'm not totally sure the vibes of the economy. The local economy in this movie seems to be bustling, but I think the bigger historical context is the racism happening at the time. And obviously, racism is connected to the economy and how the main characters are trying to advance themselves in this society. But at the moment, we're just concerned with a high-level timeline. Next, we have Marty Supreme. So Marty Supreme. And this movie is set in post-World War II, 1952 specifically, and it's set in New York City, parts of Europe, and Japan. Very important part happens in Japan. I think this film is directly influenced by the vibes of post-World War II and where the US basically had the biggest dick complex and thinks Europe and the rest of the world should be grateful to it for ending the war. I think that Marty's character is the perfect reflection of the American ethos at this time, and the movie feels very timely because I think that very ethos we see in Marty Supreme has been tested, yes, throughout the 20th century, but I also feel like that ethos is really being reevaluated at the moment and like what it means to be American. But moving along, next we have The Secret Agent, which is set in 1977 Brazil. There's a bit of North versus South energy in this film, capitalist versus non-capitalist, businessman versus academic, government versus citizens. It's giving Cold War, decolonization, oil boom era. Quickly confirmed also with like Gemini and Claude that the military dictatorship in Brazil at this time had US backing. Unfortunately, I don't know a ton more about the specific geopolitical context of Brazil-US relations at this time, but I think I do know enough that for me, the film really set itself up to still understand the story and feel the emotional truths of the time period and the political context we're in. And I think with this film, putting it on this timeline, it's like we really do start to see how these geopolitical context, at least in the 20th century, which most of these movies are taking place, is in conversation with Marty Supreme. Like these movies, I feel like are very connected, but also like everything is in conversation with everything, which brings us to the present day. The rest of these nominated films do take place in present day. No specific years, although I do kind of feel like these movies are all post-pandemic and that their context wouldn't necessarily exist without the pandemic happening. But none of them really reference the pandemic directly as we know it, right, and remember it. Although, funny enough, Hamnet is the one movie that does reference like a global sickness, the bubonic plague. So it's interesting that we might still be too close to the COVID pandemic to reference it directly. So we're kind of in this phase of looking further back for answers on how to cope. And then also in this section, I do want to shout out that One Battle After Another is actually based off a book that is set in the 1980s around the Reagan era, which is known for neoliberalism, which is basically the I love capitalism and the free market, no matter who suffers philosophy. And in my humble opinion, the Reagan era basically kicked off the mass economic inequality we're still living under today by basically completely undoing all the benefits of the New Deal and like the post-World War II opportunities that Americans had, and also just like breeding this mindset of like profit over all else. And I think this economic inequality has a lot of connections to the prevailing anti-immigrant sentiment that is proliferating, particularly in Western and American societies right now. And it's important to know and understand that to really appreciate what these films are trying to say. And lastly, it wouldn't be the present day if we didn't acknowledge digital technology and the ways it shapes societies and cultures. If you're watching this YouTube video, you probably understand this better than the average person who isn't on YouTube, but also I think the average person is on YouTube, right? At this point in time, because it's no longer 2012. So anyways, location-wise for our present day films. So Sentimental Value is set in Oslo, Norway. And then all the other films have more vague, general settings and locations. One Battle After Another is supposed to be set somewhere to represent California, West Coast sanctuary cities, as well as like the Texas borderlands, like borderlands with Mexico. Begonia is also set in a vague general setting of like the rural United States. And then I think this makes sense that both of these movies have these like vague general locations because One Battle After Another and Begonia are really trying to tell a story about the current political climate. So F1 is set in like bougie international places, right? Where F1 racetracks are. So pretty much everywhere where there's lots of money is where F1 is set. There's like a lot of different locations that are like real locations, but that's all you need to know. And so these are the times and places of the Oscar-nominated films this year. And looking at this timeline as a whole, at least for me, it really does connect all the films through a very particular political, economic sense of like industry competing with morals. I think building a timeline like this really emerged as like the prevailing way that I was synthesizing all of these films, and putting them in time and place really helped me kind of understand a lot of their themes and a lot of what these filmmakers might be trying to say and explore. I also think that usually, and this is where like fact check me in the comments, but usually I feel like there are not this many period pieces nominated for the Oscars. Now, I guess 4 of our films, so like 40% of our films are taking place in the present day. So anyways, more research to be done on that. But I think I became really aware of the time periods and the fact that there were period pieces, and so many of them in this like slate of movies, because of Timothée Chalamet and Michael B. Jordan. To me, these are like men that are super relevant to our time period now, and they're very modern. And both of their films were like so popular, talked about all the time. But they were also like period pieces, right? That were set in times that don't really, in theory, look like our own, like see digital technology, right? And I also feel like the 2 time periods covered in that film are periods that are not necessarily the ones that are covered a lot. So I might be wrong for saying that, but I feel as though there are like a ton, well, no, I know that there are a ton of World War II movies, too many in my opinion, but I feel like there are not a lot of films set in the time right after World War II, like Marty Supreme. And similarly, I feel like there are a lot of movies about the US Civil Rights Movement, probably not as many as World War II movies, so let's make some more, but I also don't think there are a ton of films or as many films about the civil rights movement as there are about films about the Jim Crow era, right? About the era before the civil rights movement, about the era that spurred the civil rights movement. So I do think those 2 movies, Sinners and Marty Supreme, are really the movies that like got me thinking about the time period and like being like, oh wow, we're really going deep into history to kind of tell a story, and like doing period pieces with like mega stars, right? Like our heartthrobs, our movie stars, like they are doing period pieces. And again, maybe this is not that wild of a take or that unorthodox of a thing that happens with Oscar movies, but it is what got me kind of started on this path. And I think that these 2 movies depicted a time period we don't often see, but then they do a really good job of having this really current feeling to them and energy in both of them that really allows, me, the viewer, or you, the viewer, to really connect with these films and our current time in a lot broader of a context, which I like. Obviously, as a person who would build a historical timeline in order to understand a group of films, I like that these films are using history to say something about our current time. I think it just says so much about what is on our minds currently. But yeah, that's the timeline. The next way in which I want to make sense of these films, or the next kind of way that I started thinking about these films, was putting them on a spectrum. From non-realism to realism. Now, I'm saying non-realism instead of surrealism because surrealism in my mind is like a very specific art movement that is associated with like a very specific aesthetic, whereas realism, yes, is also a term for an art movement that is like relates to surrealism. But I also think like realism is a more general term that we can all understand like more easily, right? As it relates to what is realistic and not realistic and what feels most basically based in our day-to-day reality versus not. So, starting off, we have Frankenstein and Sinners, a monster mash, if you will. So I think what is cool about both of these films is that they blend the real with the supernatural. And that supernatural element to me is what kind of puts them on this portion of the spectrum. Now, Sinners in particular feels more real than Frankenstein, I think is because of two things. So one, Sinners' connection to modern music, and more interestingly to me actually is how Sinners is a fresher take on the vampire trope. So vampires in Frankenstein or Frankenstein's monster or Frankenstein's creature, to be very accurate, both of these are like very classic horror movie monster kind of tropes. I think Frankenstein, the movie, is more a classic retelling of the book that it's based off of, whereas Sinners is just like this really fresh take on the trope of vampires. I do now want to mention Nosferatu here because it is also a classic retelling of the original vampire story that came out in like the last couple years. And it does feel honestly more in the vein of Frankenstein, where it's this classic retelling, but does somewhat have a different point of view than like Bram Stoker's Dracula from the 90s. So all that is to say that Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein might be like more fresh, and I just don't have anything to compare it to. But having grown up with Twilight and Vampire Diaries and having watched Dracula and Nosferatu, I have a lot of things to compare Sinners to. And I think Sinners ends up feeling more real than Frankenstein because of the way it uses the vampire trope to tell this story about Black music and racism in America. Now, I'm also sure that Frankenstein is being used as like a trope to tell a story about something else, but I didn't really get that from the movie itself as much as I did from Sinners. Now, of course, I have prior knowledge and biases towards vampires, so my assessment here can really only go so far. But that is my assessment of why I feel like Sinners feels more real than Frankenstein. Most of the other films we have nominated exist somewhat more obviously in our shared reality, like no monsters or magic, although, if you know, I don't want to spoil anything, but Begonia goes here, and that's all I'll say. And kind of next to Begonia is Marty Supreme and One Battle After Another. I think the thing that binds all three of these movies as like less real than the other realistic movies is that in this section of the spectrum, this is where absurdity lives and like intensity. And I think all three of these movies do a great job of exposing truth by showing their characters acting absurdly in very real situations in a way where I'm like, well, wait, people actually do this stuff and act like this. And that the absurdity is actually pointing out some really real things, but still pretty absurd. So it goes in this section. And I think the absurdity displayed in One Battle After the Other felt the most plausible. So I think that's why it's a bit more towards this realism side. Now, I do also want to mention that these movies are like really intense, and maybe that makes, I don't know if that makes them feel more real or less real. I guess, well, in my humble opinion, it makes them feel less real. But I would say Marty Supreme and Begonia are like panic attacks with absolutely no release of tension, whereas One Battle After Another has more of a rhythm, I would say a rhythm, where the tension ebbs and flows in this really nice way. I will say that Begonia gets the biggest shout out from me because I do love to watch a movie and not really know what's going to happen and have that tension build throughout the film. But in some point watching Begonia, I was just like so hooked, but also so anxious and so curious and so amped up that I was like, this movie needs to end. Like, I am enjoying watching this movie. This movie is insane. But I need the movie to end. I need to know what happens. I need to know how it happens. Like, I've never needed a movie to end more than I needed Begonia to end. But not because it was bad, but because it was so thrilling. And yeah, next we have F1. This movie feels fairly grounded in our reality in that it's not as absurd as these other films, but I also think it has to do with our expectations of this type of story. Here is where I will compare Marty Supreme and F1, as these are both technically sports films in that they are films that have a sport. One of the initial questions I went into watching Marty Supreme with was, is this a sports movie? And I would say, why not? But then I watched F1 and I can understand why someone would go to the mat, really fight it out to say that Marty Supreme is in fact not a sports movie. And what exactly makes it not a sports movie? Well, I would say primarily it's because the film starts our main character like off up here. Like the main character, Marty, is flying high, almost to like a delusional state, right? And then it's also kind of like charming because it's Timmy. And then the events of the movie basically bring our like star, our athlete, down so low. Like it's like a roller coaster drop, right? Like very thrilling, enjoyable ride, right? Goes all the way down here, almost crashing. And then it kind of brings the character back like just up here, maybe. Whereas on the opposite side of that, F1 is like a classic sports movie in a very enjoyable way. It's not really that deep, but it's very fun. To me, it takes all the classic tropes, right? The older, wiser washout coming to help the new young guy on the block and the struggling team and is like this lovable rebel whose unorthodox strategy brings the underdog team to victory. It could not be a more classic sports film. And so is that why it feels more real? Like, yes, because it lacks the absurdity of Marty Supreme, but it plays into this traditional framework of what people want to see when watching stories about sports. They want to see a hero succeed, but also succeed with a certain level of decorum and boundaries. So F1 ends up feeling more real because it plays into our expectations of a sports film, while Marty Supreme completely unends them. Next, we have sentimental value. I would say it feels the same level of real as F1. Like, I could see Elle Fanning's character showing up at one of Brad Pitt's races in the film. And while sentimental value has way deeper emotional conflicts than F1, the way those conflicts were explored actually felt very distant to me, which brings us to Hamnet. Now, this film has mysticism and the characters believing in premonitions, similar-ish to Sinners, but I would say the mysticism in Hamnet is portrayed more as a product of the time period rather than an actual supernatural element. Kind of like how today people believe in God, but they don't believe in vampires. So both Hamnet and sentimental value use art, theater, and film, respectively, as a way to deal with grief and family fractures. But I think Hamnet is more transcendent in its conclusion than sentimental value. It's much less subtle than sentimental value in its message, which could make it feel less real. But in my assessment, the more direct, literal references in Hamnet to the family's grief gave it more emotional truth, to me, than sentimental value, which left everything more murky and vague and unsaid. Which you could definitely argue is like more real, but I'm a very direct person, and this spectrum is based off of my perspectives and experience. So yeah, please share your own if you disagree with me. That's part of the fun of all of this. So lastly, we have our films with our most realism, right? And I put The Secret Agent and Train Dreams here. And what I found to be the connector between these two movies that might contribute to why they feel the most grounded in realism is that they depict working men. The main characters are working men, right? They have different types of jobs. One is an academic, one is a logger. There might be a more specific term, but he's a logger. But they are very respectable and admirable for the work that they do. In both of these films, these men are portrayed as good guys, doing the work they do for good reasons, whether it's for innovation and intellectual curiosity or to support their family. I think The Secret Agent has like more obvious commentary about the different types of masculinity associated with different types of work. But I think it's also a huge theme in Train Dreams. And both of these working men have to contend with the economic development of their time periods, which feels very real right now. And so what I kind of realized in this whole exploration is that I am definitely an economic determinist, which is, I kind of always knew this, but basically that means that I think everything in our lives and our cultures are dictated by the economic structure we live in and have in place in our society. So I think it makes sense why I loved both of these films so much and why they felt like most real to me. So this is where the linear explorations of these films end. I think putting these films on a historical timeline and also on a spectrum from non-realism to realism like helped me understand and synthesize what's happening in these movies, and also made me realize like what movies resonated with me the most. Because when you're watching 10 movies, you gotta find something to grasp onto and like kind of investigate like, oh, I really liked Hamnet more than Sentimental Value. Why? They're both kind of slow. I did almost fall asleep in both of them, but there was one I liked more than the other. Why? Right? Why? We gotta analyze ourselves and our thoughts and our feelings. But before I get to my official rankings and final thoughts, I do quickly want to go over some common themes / attributes that stuck out to me as I thought about all these films. I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible, as I've probably already talked enough by this point. But our first theme or attribute is gore and bloody violence. So here we have Frankenstein, One Battle After Another, Marty Supreme, The Secret Agent, Sinners, and Begonia, which is more than half of our films. There is something on the mind. Next, we have political dissent / revolutionary thinking. The Secret Agent, Begonia, One Battle After Another. Now, this is technically only 30% of our films, but if you widened this category to just politics or power, I think you'd get a lot more of the films, but we're trying to be brief in this section, so we got to move on. Our next category, or not category, our next like attribute, I would say, is one of the main characters is a woman. So that's Hamnet, One Battle After Another, Begonia, Sentimental Value. Sentimental Value is the only one where the primary character is a woman. She's not opposite anyone. These other films, the woman is one of the main characters, and then the other main character who's like just as big of a role, if not like a tiny bit bigger, is either a husband, a father, or an enemy. I know all of these themes are ripe for their own analysis, but there's only so much time. And then, okay, our next theme is that the film referenced cinema or like the art of theater and acting, I guess. So that's Sentimental Value, Hamnet, Secret Agent. Our next category, the one that actually started it all, was sex in public places where you could totally be walked in on. That's Marty Supreme, Secret Agent, Sinners, Hamnet. And yes, this was the observation of mine that kind of started this whole thing, because it just kept coming up, specifically in the period pieces, where I was like, is this just what people had to do back in the day because you're not really into the person you married or that you're currently with, or there's just a lot of like societal faux pas about who you're sleeping with, so you just gotta like get it where you can whenever, and that unfortunately cannot be your own house in like the privacy of your own home and stuff. And so it just got me thinking. I'm like, wow, this is a lot of sex in public places. But at least they were having sex, I guess, which is good back then. They weren't just scrolling TikTok. So, and then kind of related, if in some ways, our next category is the hotties. I love a hot man. And we should just give them their flowers. There was a very hot woman in The Secret Agent, the woman who's like interviewing him in the back of the film. She was so hot. I'm sure there's other hot women, but I'm sorry. The hotties are just the men. These are the ones that stuck out to me. I'm sorry for being so straight. Brad Pitt, hottie, learned that he's 62 years old. Whoever does his work or whatever he is doing, give the man an Oscar just for that. F1 doesn't need any other Oscars other than like who is aged the most, the best, and that's Brad Pitt. I could go so in depth about that, and I cannot. The next hottie is Timmy. I don't care what anyone has to say. Timmy is always up there. Wagner Moura, new hottie on the scene. Did not know who this actor was. He is incredible in this film. I love him. Michael B. Jordan, obviously on this list. I don't think that man can be in a movie and not make it on a hottie list, right? And then Jacob Elordi, but very specifically, yes, as the creature. And I feel like this might be my most polarizing category. I will say Damson Idris is hot, but F1 did not show it off enough. So unfortunately, he did not make this list. But please watch the chicken shop date with him, because if that had been under review, he would have made it. Wrapping up, next, beautiful sky shots. So we have Train Dreams, Sinners, and Hamnet. Then our penultimate category or common theme is family, child, parent relationship. We have sentimental value. We have Hamnet. We have Frankenstein. We have One Battle After Another. We got Begonia. We got Sinners. We got The Secret Agent. So that is 80% of our films. And I mentioned them in order of where it's where like family is a primary plot point versus more secondary or tertiary part of the plot. But it's definitely worth noting this was a common theme. And then our last most common theme was death/grief. So this is seen in Hamnet, Sentimental Value, Begonia, Frankenstein, Marty Supreme, One Battle After Another, The Secret Agent, Sinners, Train Dreams. Yes, that's 90% of the films. Maybe we are processing the mass deaths from the COVID pandemic and also all of the other death and destruction and upheaval in our lives and world that is unfortunately requiring us to grieve a lot. Grieve our past lives and what we've lost, like culturally, societally, artistically, and also grieving expectations of what we thought the world would look like or what we thought the world should look like. And just kind of like process our current time through the lens of loss is kind of where I land on that. And it does make me think of one of my favorite books, which is called Magic and Loss. So on that cheery note, we're going to enter my official rankings and final thoughts part of the video. So my favorite film was The Secret Agent. I think it had age-old questions of progress and development. My second favorite was One Battle After Another. I think it was the perfect mix of absurdity and relevance. Number 3, our bronze medalist, is Begonia. Again, absurdity and relevance. And then just missing the podium is Train Dreams. Again, age-old questions of progress and development. And again, I'm an economic determinist. Again, to shout out one of my favorite books, All That Is Solid Melts into Air. Very relevant right now. Everyone can read it. And should. Okay. And then number 5 is Sinners. Number 6 is Marty Supreme. 7 is Hamnet. 8 is Frankenstein. 9, F1. And 10 is Sentimental Value. Now, I'm sure you might disagree with these rankings. And luckily, you can weigh in by commenting on this video. I highly encourage you to do that and share your ideas and thoughts respectfully, because that is what makes watching movies fun. That is what makes watching a YouTube video fun, is just like engaging with the culture. I have said a lot of things, and I hope that out of all of the things that I have said, it has spurred some type of thought in you and enriched you in some way. And so kind of like a segue, I think that's part of why I went down this path of like watching all of the films nominated for Best Picture is that I wanted to feel some sort of enrichment. I wanted to be inspired. I wanted to soak up stories about life, and I wanted to see what like else is on everyone else's mind, right? Like I think we are like see what is on everyone else's mind and like what they meticulously made to share that, right? So I think, you know, it always gets back into like the digital technology, but I do think in an age where so much is happening, so much has happened, we are constantly commenting on it, and absorbing other people's comments on that thing. It is amazing to take a step back and consume media that has been thought about, worked upon for years, worked on by many different teams of people, that is in reaction to what is going on, but has also taken the time to reflect and analyze and also just feel and put together this movie to say something. And so I think that was kind of what I was looking for, right? Like if you want to see commentary about what's happening currently, you just go online, right? I think I was kind of after, like what made me want to watch all of the films nominated for Best Picture is because I think it really does give a good sense of what is currently collectively on all of our minds. I do think it's funny though, because I think I went through this like timeline, spectrum, all of this exploration, because like some of these these movies do all connect, right? But the primary thing that is binding them all together is that a cultural institution said that they were the best movies to have come out last year. And I think that it is fun to explore that idea, and whether you agree these are the best films that came out, if you think these best films like resonate with you or not, I think that it is fun to explore that and see if these resonate with you or not. Someone asked me if like who I think should win versus who I think will win. First, shoulds aren't real. Two, like I don't know, they're all good movies. Like I don't think I know enough to say like what is best versus worst, right? It's like the Academy who votes, and I think that's one very specific perspective in the world. And I think these are people who are in the film industry. And I think that's fair that if you're in the film industry, you get to vote on what you think the best film was. You like know how the sausage gets made. You have this deeper appreciation for all the elements that go into a movie than just your average movie watcher. I think that's also why things like this exist, right? Like I can just make a YouTube video about my thoughts. I don't need to say like, this film should have won Best Picture, because it's like, I don't know, I can literally go into an hour and a half analysis about all of these films. Like, I don't know if it's really that important whether one gets, you know, marked as saying that it wins or not wins, or is the best and not the best. Like, you know, just being nominated is an honor. But more than that, just watching movies is important, and thinking about them, and watching movies that have a very high degree of artistic thought put into them. Yeah, I hope that made sense. Oh yeah, and then I'm just checking the little notes I did write. So I do think all of these movies are good enough to watch once. I think I have personal taste that make me like them more. I think I have personal tastes that make me like some of them more than others. I also think like a good example is Begonia. So if you're a friend who tells me that you get anxious watching movies, you get panic attacks, you look up the end of a movie because it'll make you anxious not to, and it's like not Begonia, it's like a very standard movie, and you do that, then I'm going to tell you not to watch Begonia. Skip it, even though I loved it, right? I think Sentimental Value was one of my friends' favorite movies of the year. It really didn't resonate with me for reasons about who I am, right? And so I just think when we get wrapped up into like, what is the best? Who deserves to win? Who deserves the acclaim? We're like really missing the point. And the point is to watch a movie and try to understand what the filmmaker wanted you to understand. Try to read into it and understand how it resonates with you, and then talk about that with someone. And I think that's it. I think that is it. Thank you for watching this. Thank you to my mom. Should I do an Oscar speech? Thank you to my mom, and my mom for, she's a film major. She loves films, and she watches the Oscars every year. And I know she'll watch this video, and I know she'll be really delighted by it. Thank you to my friends who watched all these films with me and listened to all of my first round thoughts of all of this. Thank you to you watching this. Shout out my friend Lauren, who gave me all of the technical advice on how to film a video, or like with recommendations with the microphone and the stands. Who else am I thanking? I kind of want to say thank you to myself. Thank you to myself for doing this and making time for it and committing to the bit. And that's it. Please go watch a movie.